Hi guys, so today we're going to start talking about our freshwater supplies and what's going on with these things. So even though most of our planet is covered in water, the vast majority of that water is not in a form that is usable or drinkable to us, at least in its original form. So access to clean fresh water is a very big issue on our planet, especially as our population starts to increase. So where is our water? Water is considered a renewable resource. It's part of the water cycle, which we should have learned a little bit about already. But it is also considered limited because even though it's renewable, we're using it faster than it's being produced. And so our stores of fresh water are being depleted. And part of why that's occurring is because of our very, very large population of humans. All right, we are using that water for all kinds of activities that pull it out of these reserves faster than it can be refilled. Our other things that are causing problems is the fact that the water does not fall evenly throughout the entire earth. So there's some places that have excess of water and experience flooding, and there's other places that are not getting enough water and are experiencing severe drought where they could actually turn into a desert. So how much water people use depends on where they live and the time of year. Sorry, my face is covering the time of year. And the time of year. So like think wet seasons, dry season. So if you think about Africa on the plains, and during the dry season is when all the animals migrate because they're looking for water. They're looking for water resources. And so they will migrate to find them. And in the wet season, they have monsoons and all these temporary ponds and lakes are formed and water is plentiful. So it really does depend on the time of year in some places. So when we're talking about our surface water, what we're talking about is any body of water that you can easily access from the surface of the earth. So there's a lot of these. Any of our still bodies of water like ponds and lakes, including rivers and streams, anything like that is considered surface water. In the United States, the biggest source of surface water is the Mississippi River Basin. So when you look at the Mississippi River, you can see that it stretches all the way across the United States and takes up or attaches to most of the United States. It's actually the third largest watershed in the world, which is huge. All right, it covers and drains 41% of the land. That's a good thing because it gives a lot of people access to fresh water. The bad thing is anything we do on that land can affect that watershed. So other sources of surface water are as our glaciers melt, they are creating new ponds and lakes where there were not ponds and lakes before, which is a good thing to have that reservoir of fresh water. We certainly need it. The bad thing is the reason why they're melting, which is climate change. We can also get this from snow melt. So when it snows in the winter up on the mountains, as that snow melts throughout the year, that creates streams that come down and will refill our still water sources. All right, wetlands are also a great source of fresh water and really good to have in your ecosystem. They serve a lot of purposes, and we will talk about them more later on. All right, all of these water sources are replenished by what's called runoff. So when you're talking about the water cycle, it's the precipitation that falls down, and runoff is when it falls down quickly, like this picture down here. When it runs down quickly and it pools on the surface, and then it creates little streams that are going to go down in elevation, and all that water is going to go somewhere. So usually it goes into some other body of water and fills it up. And then if you get too much rain, your rivers and your lakes can start rising up past the banks, and that's when you would get flooding. So one of the things we're really concerned with as far as the quality of our water is what is going on in the watershed. So I mentioned earlier the Mississippi Basin watershed, and that anything we do on land will affect the watershed. What a watershed is all the land in an area that drains into a certain body of water. And this has to do with elevation. So these peaks here at the top of the mountains are the beginnings of your watershed. And as it elevates down, the water is going to run down with gravity, right? And all that's going to land up in one water source that's there, and usually in the valley, right? So if there's pollution going on up here, so somebody, Billy Bob's up here, and he dumped a bunch of chemicals in his backyard, and he's like, it's all right, it's in the backyard, it's not going to affect anything. But then the next day it rains. Rain will pick up that pollution, take it down the elevation, and right into this major water source, which may very well be your source of drinking water. So what we do on land affects the water. And so when we pollute on land, we're polluting our own drinking water, which is not too bright. So we need to make sure that we are disposing of our chemicals properly so they do not land up in our freshwater sources. So when we look at Virginia, we are a member of many watersheds. We have the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is a gigantic one that spans multiple states. But then we also have smaller, more localized watersheds that are associated with the rivers that run through our area. So for us, we're Roanoke County, and so we are part of the Roanoke River's watershed. So anything we do will affect this river that is running through here, okay? If you go a little north, we got the James River. So if you're up in Botetourt, you might go up in like Buchanan, you might be on the James River. If you go further south, down near Radford in Pulaski, you got the New River water basin. So we have several rivers in our area, and so we have several watersheds, but all of you live in the Roanoke watershed. So just like I said earlier, when you're talking about a watershed, the water is going to go down in elevation into what's called a stream valley. So it's in these valleys that water accumulates, and usually that's where you get streams, which then further dump into rivers, and then eventually everything goes to the ocean. So anything on land, the water picks it up and sheds it from the land as the rain falls or snow melts, and it's channeled into these bodies of water. Water is called a universal solvent because most things dissolve in water. And so when they dissolve in water, it readily picks up any of this chemical pollution, fertilizers, dog poop, all kinds of stuff that's on your yard, and they will take it down into your water source. So what you do on land, yet again, affects your water quality, and fresh water is very, very limited, so we need to take good care of it. So I found this picture. I found it very interesting. If you look down here, this is the New River. The New River is a weird one because it travels actually north. That has to do with elevation. Down here at the blue X is where Radford takes its drinking water from. So Radford takes its drinking water here, and it dumps its wastewater at the red X, which is actually over the county line from Radford into Pulaski. So they're taking their water and they're dumping their wastewater in the same spot. Now their wastewater is treated. They're not just dumping poo water into the river. All the chunks are removed, but sometimes there are still contaminants in the water even after treatment. That's why you shouldn't be dumping any medications down the toilet, because all those things are dissolved in water and are not necessarily filtered out through the water treatment plant. So they pull their drinking water out here, and then they dump their wastewater here. Now, Pulaski is smart enough that at the yellow X, Christiansburg, Blacksburg, all of those guys, this is where they're pulling their drinking water from. So they pull their drinking water right before the wastewater gets dumped in. And that's because if there's anything contaminated in here, they're pulling water before that. So their drinking water is not being affected. But then as you go down, all these other places, guess what? They're after this. And if you go down the other direction, the New River reaches into North Carolina. And so anything that's getting dumped into the river up there is still in the river when Radford is pulling their water out. And this is why we need to be very aware of what we are putting in our water, because in a lot of cases and a lot of places, the wastewater and the drinking water are coming from the same place. So let's talk flooding. It's been raining a lot here lately. Actually, as I record this, it's raining like cats and dogs. All right, so floods are becoming way, way more common. This again has to do with climate change. All right, as climate change occurs, our weather becomes more extreme because with heat, molecules move more. And that's what's going on. Stuff inside our atmosphere is moving faster, and so you get more extreme events. So floods are becoming more common. And so we have more runoff, and when we have more runoff, you have more flooding. And this is occurring because of a multitude of things. So one is that we are not allowing rivers to naturally move. They do move naturally as they erode banks, but because we build on either side of the banks, that people live on the river and businesses are on the river, So we tend not to let the river naturally move, and sometimes sediment comes down. It can narrow the river, or we're narrowing it with the human-made structures that we're putting on the river. And so when this happens, when your river is narrowed and it rains a lot, it fills up quicker and it reaches the banks quicker, and then you have more flooding. Okay. Other things is when you have a lot of urban areas near your rivers, which is the case, we tend to build cities near areas that have rivers because in the past, this is how we shipped goods in and out of our cities. And when we have all these cities there, you have a lot of asphalt. And asphalt does not absorb water. It runs off of it, and it runs off quick. And so instead of some of that water seeping down into the ground like a sponge, and then it would actually refill something else called an aquifer, it runs off and makes these large streams that when they hit other pieces of asphalt or rivers or lakes, instead of some of it being absorbed elsewhere, it creates flooding as well. Okay, so these are all very real issues. On top of that, we have natural wetlands that we keep destroying. All right, we keep filling them up and covering them over to build on top of them. And wetlands act like sponges. So they soak up water and they help prevent flooding because of that in more developed areas. But we keep building on top of them instead of preserving them. Okay, so the water for flooding must either flow faster, eroding the riverbanks and causing trees and structures to fall, or rise higher, which is very common, causing floods when the waters spill over the riverbanks. So I used to live over in Portsmouth area where I used to teach, and in 2003 I was there, and this was a picture from my friend's front porch. The Hurricane Isabel came through, and she lived in Virginia Beach, on the edge of Virginia Beach, and there was a boat floating down the road. That's a road where the boat is. And so it obviously came up in her house, filled her basement, and was a couple inches on the first floor, flooding. And this is because that area has a lot of development. And so if you look at what we considered a disaster area when a hurricane hits, it is a huge part of our state. So you can see that over here. If there's a big hurricane coming, this is all considered a disaster area because that area will readily flood. It's low elevation and it's very highly built up, so lots of asphalt, and all of the water will rush into the little rivers that are there, the waterways, and you will have this huge flooding. And that's what we see occurring in Virginia Beach and Norfolk area every time they have a hurricane, whether it's a big hurricane or a small hurricane, does not matter. It's also the same pattern that we see down in Louisiana, in New Orleans, when those hurricanes hit. So if you look at the elevation in this area, that again, there's a lot of population here. So if you're looking at elevation, wetlands are the purple area. And so they do have some wetlands, or where there were wetlands, but like up here where this little square is, they have this labeled as wetland, but this is actually a military base where they build boats. And so that's not really wetland, that's cement. They covered up the wetland. So elevation, what you're looking for is higher elevations, not lower elevations. So the tan is good. These are the areas that might not flood. Anything below that is going to flood. All right, so all the red, yellow, green is all going to flood if there's any rise in the water levels. And so you're talking about a lot of land with a huge population of people. So all these people would have to be evacuated when this occurs. And that's a crazy thing to do. So my husband works for VDOT, and when we worked at VDOT, one of the things they were looking at is creating another tunnel from Virginia Beach back to the mainland, because every time they had one of these water events, which are becoming more and more common, they had to close down the tunnel going into Virginia Beach and open all the lanes to get people out as quickly as they can, because it was such a large population that had to be evacuated.
That needs a picture retake, please come to the lobby outside of the main office at this time. If you need a picture retake, you're a student in the building, please come to the
Sorry,
lobby
announcements.
outside of the main office at this time.
All right, so let's talk Roanoke. Roanoke gets its fair amount of flooding. So the most famous flood around here was in 1985. So here's some pictures. I did not live here then. You guys were not born then. But you might recognize these areas. And these are areas still that we have problems with flooding. And some of the places have been looking at Roanoke specifically for testing out new technologies to predict flooding better. And so they're going to be putting a sensor in to the Roanoke River to kind of keep track of the rate at which the river increases so that it can warn people well before flooding occurs so that you can evacuate safely. So ideally, instead of having all this runoff and flooding, what we'd like to have is more groundwater. So groundwater is any water that seeps through the soil and goes deep down in the ground and fills things called aquifers. Aquifers are incredibly useful. They're bodies of water that we can tap into to get fresh water. And then if you have a well on your property, that's what your well is dug into. They dig the well down, you can see one in the picture, through the permeable layer that the water can go through. That's what permeate means, it can go through, into the aquifer. And this water is held there by this impermeable layer, which is usually solid rock or clay, right? And so the water will percolate through and then reach this aquifer, and it's stored there. So when we do not have everything covered in asphalt and it rains, some of this water percolates down, refills these aquifers. When we have everything covered in asphalt, like roads and driveways and things like that, the water cannot get into the ground because the asphalt is not permeable. And so it runs off instead and makes these big body of waters that flood on the surface. So what we really need is more permeable layers, all right, to fill up these groundwater resources. So the water table separates the zone of saturation from the zone of aeration. So here's your water table right here. Saturation is when it's filled with water. So think of your sponge as saturated, it's filled with water. And zone of aeration, it's filled with air instead, little pockets of air. So you can see saturation, aeration right there. So some of the things that we can do with this, and they have come up with, is they now have permeable parking lots. And there's companies that create it. It is more expensive, which is why it's not popular. But we do know how to create basically asphalt parking lots that water can still flow through. And again, when I worked over in Portsmouth, because flooding is such a huge problem there, they were reclaiming some wetlands in Paradise Creek Nature Park. And when they designed the parking lot for people to go and check out the nature park, they created a permeable parking lot. So when it rains, the water goes right through, and it helps to prevent some of that flooding and creates freshwater resources for us. So these are choices that we can make. When you guys go out there and you buy a home and you have to replace your driveway at some point, you can decide what you want your driveway to be out of. Now gravel works wonderfully. If you have a gravel driveway, that's super permeable. A lot of people don't like gravel because when it rains real hard, it moves. But in the meantime, it's cheaper and it's very, very permeable, which will reduce flooding in your house if you live in a flood zone. If you're putting a bunch of asphalt around your house and you're in a low elevation, you're just begging your house to fill with water, okay? So, and then you can also look into that new permeable driveways, which is what I'm trying to talk my husband into. So groundwater is a really beautiful thing, and sometimes groundwater makes it to the surface. So aquifers release a lot of water, groundwater, from the surface by geysers, all right? So springs are from groundwater, geysers are from groundwater, and your wells pull from groundwater. So geysers occur when there's a whole bunch of pressure and heat on the aquifer, and then eventually that builds up and you get this big burst of energy, and then it goes down and it has to build up all over again. So we have a famous aquifer called the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States. It's right in the center, and this is where all of our big farming occurs, right? The bread basket of the United States. So in the Midwest, this aquifer is what is being used to irrigate everything, all our farms around there, to create our food. The problem is we're not using it efficiently, and we're using it faster than it recharges. And again, it's not recharging because we're covering things with asphalt, which is not permeable. So it's not going down into the aquifer as fast as it could. And of course, we're not using it at an appropriate rate. Okay? As the human population grows, it demands more and more food. So hopefully our population starts leveling off as we saw in the last unit, or possibly even decreasing slowly though. We don't want to go too fast like Japan. Slowly, so that we can keep our freshwater reserves, because we are really at a point where scientists are starting to really be concerned about our ability to maintain a freshwater supply for humans. So the Ogallala, you have 225,000 square miles that this thing covers. It is gigantic. But just because it's gigantic doesn't mean it couldn't run out. All right, it is a major source of water for all the agriculture, municipal water and industrial water. But again, 70% of our water is used for agriculture. So they're the main ones that are going to have to change some habits to preserve this water. We are now greatly pulling water at a much faster rate than it is recharged. And in some places, the aquifer has run dry, where it's at a higher elevation. So this is a very real problem. And if the Ogallala Aquifer goes down, the Midwest really doesn't get that much rain. Without this aquifer, it could very well turn into desert, which would cause a catastrophe for our country, like being able to grow food. It would be a really big deal. All right, guys, so now that I left you on that depressing note, we'll learn more about water next time.